Hello, another bird here. In this video, I'm going to be talking about Keys 101 and Introduction to Keys. What is this about? It's about keys, a high-level overview, different types of keys, the key profiles, the key bitting, materials to make them, special purpose and locksmith keys, some unique keys out there that are just kind of interesting, and how you can maintain and clean keys. It's not about musical keys, keyboard keys, map keys, chroma key. We're not going to go into a lot of details about locks. We'll have to talk about it some, but our focus won't be lock design. We're not going to be talking about keying systems, so we're not going to get into master keying, Meson keying, complex keying, cross keying. Um, Maybe we'll do a video on that one day. I suspect there's a lot of information already out there if you're interested in that too for videos. I'm not going to be going into key manufacturing. I don't know enough about it right now to really speak to it, but I would like to learn and maybe I can share some of that one day too. Impressioning and lockpicking and lock manipulation is not going to be a major focus either. So we're really going to be talking about how to use keys normally and how they're used and just sort of giving an introduction to them. So this won't really be a manipulation instruction video. So I know the lock sport viewers may not be their favorite video. They don't need keys. And then we're not going to talk about ornamental jewelry or mythical keys. So we'll focus on real functional keys and not ones that were just used for display. If you are interested in like key artwork, no kickbacks to me, but one of the ones I like is some of the stuff by Michael Moorkirk. You can check his Etsy shop out there, and he has some pretty interesting designs. So general categories of keys. We've got mechanical, electrical, biometric, knowledge-based, or keyless systems. We're going to try to go through each of these and look at different keys for all of these, or almost all of these, except the knowledge-based, which is sort of keyless systems. And generally, this is, I guess knowledge base might be the real antique system, but then we'll sort of progress from mechanical to electrical and mention biometric. So it can be layered in hybrid use. You can see electrical and biometric systems will use mechanical keys as reliable backups. Mechanical and electrical systems can use knowledge-based keys to increase security for your two-factor authentication. So that's like your key plus combination or key plus PIN, or RFID plus PIN. And then you can have electrical systems can enforce policies and be reject keys or provide auditing for mechanical keys. So they can sort of provide logging where the mechanical system still does the primary functions of like access control. So what are some types of mechanical keys? We've got lift hook, warded, screw, spiral, lever, tumbler, pen tumbler, wafer slider. I know those are different locks, but they're similar keys. Disk detainer, and magnetic. Um, and there can be a lot of overlap here as well. Most keys use some kind of wording. We'll get into that more. But I guess I would say that these categories are not like black and white of something automatically fits in here. They can sort of fluctuate, and with higher security locks, you tend to see combinations of these systems being used together. So the first one we'll look at is a lift hook key. So here you can see some photos sort of showing the general operation of it. When you hear about like the Egyptian pen tumblers, this is the sort of system that they're talking about. It's commonly considered a precursor to the modern pen tumbler. I would just note that these pens are held in place typically by gravity, or they might even have some type of spring, but they're not split or stacked pens. So I would say that like you can't typically overset them. So it's not a true pen tumbler or a wafer lock or anything like that in the modern sense. Definitely a precursor, and we can see the similarities there, but also some fairly big differences as well. So yeah, that key would be slid in there, and you could lift up those pins, and then you could hook that bolt and just retract it. So here's some examples of those kind of lift hook keys from 300 BC up to the 3rd century. Um, I have seen, when I was looking through this, I saw that Some of the ones in like the 1st and 3rd century, they would refer to them as Roman period, but would also be coming out of Egypt. So I think that there were some bronze keys. So on the left we see it's iron, on the right it's bronze. I think there were, from what I saw online, there were bronze keys coming out of Egypt as well, um, although they're typically referred to as Roman period. So here we can see some more ones from the 1st and 7th century Roman bronze keys. Um, and these are some pretty intricate examples that are pretty cool to see. It would be really interesting to be able to see the locks that these went into. Um, the one on the far right, this is also a good example of bronze disease that we'll talk about later on. But if just letting you note for now, it might be something you want to look back at. And they're still being used today. There's related forms being produced today, handcrafted in wood and iron within Dogon communities and Amazi artisans in Morocco, Berbers. So in here we can see a photo of this wooden door lock that would have been opened with a lift key in Tele Dogon country in 1983. So the next big one is warded keys. Here's a little animation showing a typical warded key you might see in the 1800s. There are massive variations of this. It is probably the largest variety of key out there. But here is a typical common usage of a warded key. We see their usage throughout time, from the 1st century Roman period. They're still manufactured today by master. Top left, you can see an early example of a Roman warded key. They also built these into rings, which is kind of neat. 9th century, you can see a Viking slide key. That slide key style that's shown there for that 9th century, you also see a lot in Asia, in the Middle East. You see that being used. 15th century Egyptian slide key next. That's I think a really pretty example of a slide key. Some of those slide keys actually interacted with some springs. They sort of compressed some springs inside the lock to help it open. But that's just an FYI. They didn't necessarily just push directly on a bolt. Next, you see a 16th century Italian key. After that, we see the 16th century French masterpiece key, and you can see that comb at the bottom. That is a key that would have been produced to probably apply for completing like not an apprenticeship, but to apply to be sort of a master status in a guild, a locksmith guild, in 16th century France. So this would have been created to demonstrate their skills as locksmiths, and why they should be a master locksmith. This next one, 18th, 20th century night latch slide key, Odell, I think it's also commonly called. And then after that, we see a 19th century warded key, also commonly called a skeleton key. And we'll talk more about that in a second, skeleton keys. So skeleton keys or pass keys refer to a warded key that has had enough of the bitting removed to allow it to open multiple locks. In general, the public will call almost any type of key you can imagine a skeleton key. It's commonly used to refer to any type of vintage or antique key. So in the general public, the terminology is being lost. There's a lot of different versions of them, and there's a good paper that goes into what is a skeleton key by Richard Phillips, 2021, Skeleton Keys Explained Correctly, and that's free online, and you can check it out. On the right here, you can see even in 1853, Hobbes is talking about it in his rudimentary treatise on the construction of locks, about how these keys can be filed to allow them to open more than one lock. So they're very generally weak security, because the key bitting can just be filed down to allow it to open more locks. And here's some example of worded keys and box of words and how they can actually get really elaborate. So these are the OG cutaways. And these might also be used as like demonstrations of somebody's locksmithing skill in the 16th to 18th century. And I think they're really cool to look at as far as cutaways go of how the wording interacts with the key flag or key bitting there. One of the keys that kind of stands out as interesting is the Solomon Henry keys, patented in 1779. So this is a worded key, but the tip of it is actually hinged, so it can fall down. So when you would slide this into the lock, the tip of it could just fall down in the back, and it acts like a normal worded key. But it allowed the profile to be much smaller, so more sort of a bullet hole to restrict access to tools for like picking. And I think it's interesting because it's probably the earliest example of having some sort of interactive component for the purpose of improving security. We also have, here's another example of worded key I just thought was interesting. There's a bow in the middle that could slide to the left or the right, and that would allow it to become a larger handle, and this would be a two-sided key where you could use it on multiple locks. Here's some modern worded keys. On the left, you see a flat worded key. In the middle, you see a master key, three versions of a master worded key. Actually, I'm not sure if that's master, but it looks very similar to ones master would produce, where the wording has been filed down, and that would allow it to open more locks. And then on the far right, you can see this is the same system typically used for like your mini padlocks or diary keys. The next type of key we're going to look at is screw or spiral keys. So you see these starting around the 14th century, and they're essentially they can be the screw or the nut, so to speak. Um, but they'll generally depress some sort of spring-loaded bolt inside a barrel lock, and they'll either push it or pull it depending on how it's set up. But they're essentially just, it's like screwing in a bolt or screwing on a nut that'll adjust the bolt's position and allow the shackle to open. Um, so you can see a few examples there. There are different ways this could be implemented. You see them in India used for like trick locks or puzzle locks. But the vast majority of the time you see them on these sort of barrel locks. Here's some examples of modern screw or spiral keys. On the left is a DAC Gunmaster metal trigger lock, and on the right we have a plastic trigger lock. So these are locks that would be screwed over the trigger of a firearm, of a gun, in order to prevent access to the key, or excuse me, prevent access to the trigger. And you would just use those keys that essentially screw a bolt in or out. The DAC Gunmaster one does use a slightly, very slightly unique profile. Um, I mean, you can see the profile on the right. Very, very basic, um, very low security. Next keys we're going to talk about are lever keys. So, starting in 1778, Robert Barron patents a double-acting tumbler lock. And if you look back before him, what you see is you see these Banbury sort of woodstock locks that are these locks that are made sort of carved into wood and attached to a door. And they're a form of wooden lock that's it's typically referred to as a Banbury lock. And so what Barron is doing here is he's improving that, and he's adding tumblers, these lever tumblers, that have to be in the correct position for that bolt to move. What's really unique about these tumblers that you don't see at any point in history up until now is that the tumblers can also be overset. So you can go too far lifting them, and you actually have to have these at the correct position. Not too high, not too low, well, obviously with some tolerances for that bolt to go forward. And so this is certainly a new style lock and a new style keys that accompany it. Um, yep, and so early worded keys may have had cuts on them that look like they go to a lever lock, but it could have just been the warding. Warding can get really intricate and have a lot of different looks to it. So you can have keys from earlier periods that look like, oh, they had some kind of lever lock, but it was really just warding. And this illustration is from John Chubb on the construction of locks and keys. So here's an example of a lever key and how that would work. You can see it's lifting the tumblers and can push the bolt. So we'll just talk a little bit about terminology too. This is another one where everything gets called a skeleton key. And some of these terms are certainly overloaded, and you'll hear different people refer to them differently. So on the far left, we have the bow, the head, or the handle of the key. The ferrule, generally referring to where that bow attaches to the shank. The length of it there being the shank, the shaft, or the stem of the key. Then you have that this round portion. Let me see if I can get this round portion right here, referring to the collar or the shoulder. That's where the key is going to stop going into the lock. That it's going to hit the keyway is going to bump this and it'll stop. This part right here is the pin. Throating is the portion passing the keyway, so everything inside the lock, right of the collar, post and nose, generally everything past the flag or the bit to the end of the key. Typically, the cuts you see on the front side are going to be for warding and can be called a cleft. And typically, the cuts you see on the top here, if you see them like these sharp cuts, drops like this, that's typically going to be for a lever lock. But that's also not a hard, fast rule. There are definitely lever locks that can have the bitting in this direction, and there are definitely warded locks that have warding in this direction. But just as a general rule of thumb. Um, and then this portion right here from the collar to the flag or to the bit is called the neck right there. You can also have a barrel key. So these are the bit and barrel keys are the most popular version of lever keys. There's certainly a huge variety out there, but these are going to be the most common. This is also what you're going to see in your handmade keys from the 1800s. So most of the terminology here is the exact same as the previous slide. You'll see that we just changed the terminology a little bit there from a pin to a pipe and barrel. And then instead of having a post and nose, it might be referred to as the muzzle and nose. If you have one of these keys that has a sleeve, sometimes they were made with sleeves that would protect this pipe or barrel. They would sometimes call that portion that's under the sleeve the tongue, as opposed to the throating, which is everything to the right of the collar or the shoulder here. So here's some different lever keys you might see. On the left, a Squire 440, and you can see very clearly the bitting there on the left side there. The same on the right. I thought this one on the right was cool, this tan 10 lever lock, because what you see is you actually see bitting cuts, but then you see the warding cut, the one warding cut going parallel with the shaft here, which is not very common. So that I thought was kind of neat to see. Here's some more. So on the left, you've got a pipe key, yeah, with some very standard bitting cuts there. And on the right, we've got something with a double bitted. So you can see it's got bitting on both the left and the right. They don't all have to be better barrel keys. They can come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. On the left, we've got this 8-lever flat key, like you might see on a safe deposit box or something like that. On the right, you've got this Folger Adams, more paracentric keyway that you would see for a prison lock. And this one's actually from Joliet, Illinois. I'm not sure if I said that correctly. Joliet, Illinois, which is interesting because I believe he also, not only did he sell the locks there, but I think he designed the prison for the city there, or the jail for the city there. So he considered himself I forget the term he used, something like a penal engineer. So here's some more lever keys. So on the left, we've got these mid 20th century Guri locks. You also see these in Russia and the USSR, and in Europe. I actually should say Europe, Eastern Europe, because I'm not entirely sure if they were just made in the USSR or where all they were made. But you can see those flat keys would actually interact with levers in those. And on the right, we've got a US street letter box lock. And this one has a handmade key to it, and that would have pushed the levers up as well. And here's a very high security lever lock, a Fichet 787. A very interesting design. In these, it has a locking system to prevent interacting with the levers once they've been set to a position. So it uses a sort of locking staging mechanism that makes it extremely pick resistant. And this is a modern lock that's still sold today. Very high security lever lock. Okay, next, pen tumbler keys. This is the one that pretty much probably everyone's familiar with. So we're just going to go over some terminology real quick. Just like with the lever keys, we've got a bow, a head, a handle, and we have a shoulder where it is stopped going into the keyway, and that prevents it from going further. The bottom down there, called a blade and shaft, tip at the end. Not sure if tip is just referring to this angle up or if it can also just be the very tip there, probably a little bit of both. So the peaks there are called ridges, teeths, or projections. And then your valleys are called cuts, notches, or landings. And this whole section up top right here is called your bitting. So the bitting includes your ridges and your cuts. All of that is the bitting there. And then the grooves right here is going to be for your warding, called keyway milling, or your profile contours. Any of these terms would refer to this milling that occurs right here along the side of the key. Here's some example of pen tumbler keys. Um, Though on the left we've got a flat pen tumbler key for an NPS, spelling error there, rotary lock, National Park Service rotary lock from the early 20th century. So you can have these pen tumbler keys without any of that grooving or warding. You can have flat implementations of them. The rest of those are relatively standard pen tumbler keys, which you're probably familiar with. This is an interesting example from starting in the early 1970s, late 1960s. We see some angular cuts on the key bitting. This is on the left, we see a Medico bitting, and this actually allows the key to not just lift the pins in the lock, but rotate them. In the right, we see one by Corbin, Russell, and Emhart that also does angular bitting. And it has this interesting comb tooth pattern on the bottom where it would actually, as the key was turning, um, it would need those spaces, I believe, to, let me see if I can remember this correctly, to allow it to pass, to rotate past the top pins, the driver pins, and they would flip through those gaps there. And they were, I believe, sued out of production by Medico for patent infringement, if I understand that correctly. So here we have some pin tumbler dimple keys. So these are also pin tumbler keys, just like we saw before. The basic principle of the lock is the same, but the key shape changes. So on the far left, we've got what they call a smiley dimple key. These have become a lot more popular lately, coming from Asia and from China. And that's just referring to the sort of slightly smiley face look on the keyway. You start seeing them from 1965. You see the Sergeant Kiso. That's all of these ones on the right here are really considered higher security um, pen tumbler locks. But yeah, we have a Sergeant Kiso from 1965, a multi-lock classic from 1973, and a West 941. You also can see these pen tumbler tubular keys or push pump keys because they push or pumps, the pin tumblers. So on the left, that's a key you've probably seen on vending machines pretty often, an ace tubular key. On the right, you may not have seen, this is a van lock key, and it is in principle very similar to the ace tubular key, um, but the tolerances are very well made, and I believe they have security pins in them, and it's generally considered a much higher security lock. The ace tubular key on the left is generally lower security and usually can be impressioned fairly quickly. And then we can also have pin tumblers with interactive components on them. So these are kind of interesting where you might have um, one portion, like a spring-loaded bolt, push up on one of these interactive elements, which can then push through and hit a pin on the opposite side of the lock and sort of move these. So we've got these moving components in the key, like with the Solomon Henry key, only modern examples of that. Um, and these are all considered high security locks here. Um, yep. If you're interested in more on these, I would check out LockWiki, um, or Lockpickers United Belt Explorer, or High Security Locks, the High Security Mechanical Locks by Graham Pulford. Um, that should give you more information on how this works. And this one I've included sort of as an interesting novelty. This is a not produced anymore, but a very interesting key. It's a pin tumbler chain key. So kind of like his Solomon Henry key, the tip bends and it can wind through the keyway there. And it also provides some security from people observing the key and copying the key visually when it's not in the lock. The key bitting is never really visible the way it's set up. Okay, so next we're going to talk about wafer and slider keys. So wafer and slider locks are two different locking mechanisms. I think the general terminology now is that a wafer becomes a slider once it's interacting with a sidebar, is the rule of thumb I've heard. But from a key perspective, you don't see that sidebar. The key doesn't see that. It doesn't know that. So these keys are really can be used interchangeably, or I shouldn't say they should be used can be used interchangeably, but from a user standpoint, there's no observable difference necessarily. And these also originate in the 19th century along with pin tumblers. Um, they're most easily identified when they're using that sort of sidewinder or laser cut profile. Um, but they can look like any other type of key. They can look like a worded key, a lever key, a pin tumbler key. They don't typically look like dimple keys, um, but they may be mixed with a dimple key for higher security stuff. So you may see a dimple key with some side winding for the sliders. So on the left here, you've got a quick set Smart Key Gen 3. It looks like probably most people, when they see those keys, they think, oh, this is a standard pen tumbler like I've had in the past. But they've actually got a pretty intricate slider mechanism going on inside there that allows the lock to be rekeyed using the correct key and a small pen. You can open the lock and then rekey it for a new key. In the middle here, we see an EVA 3KS, which has got the really cool looking, I guess, laser track. So I guess I should go back to the laser track or laser cut profile. It's not actually cut by laser, but apparently when they first came out, people believed they were, and so that's where it sort of got that terminology. Um, but it's being milled. And then in this one, you can actually see the sliders there in the middle there and how those sliders would fall into those grooves and be lifted as a key would go in. And on the far right, we've got this CEI 5 colors key from, and here you can see on the left side, you've got the track for the slider. Sliders or wafers to go there. Um, Yeah, and that track is very indicative of a wafer or slider lock. Here's some neat ones as well, some different variations. This Yuma 750 on the far left is a really interesting lock that completely spins completely freely when the wrong key is put in. Um, in the middle, we've got this Vishay Bauchi push pump lock, so you can see how it looks completely different than most of the keys we've seen so far. Um, and then on the far right, you've got this chromer protector, and you can see it looks like a lever lock in a lot of ways there. The bitting, it looks like a double bitted lever lock. Um, Next key is going to talk about our disk container keys. So I believe the first you see these is mid 18th century for Polhem's lock, oftenly referred to as a Scandinavian or Swedish lock. Um, they look kind of like old, large warded keys, but they are actually interacting with disks inside the lock, and they're not just avoiding warding, but actually correctly positioning those disks inside the lock. And so you see those, yeah, in the 1700s. And then later on, probably the most well-known disk container by far is the Abloy Classic keys in 1907. A very simple design, but very reliable in a variety of weather conditions, and also provides very good security. These are generally considered higher security locks. Um, in the middle, or third there, we have Rosengren's 32A. I included this because I thought it was interesting because the vast majority of the disk container keys have this sort of rounded shape or oval shape, but here you can see one that has it looks more like a almost like an old lever key. It looks kind of like a flat lever key, um, but in this case we are dealing with disks that we're rotating to. And then on the far right, we've got an Abloy ProTech. I think that patent was around 1999. This is another high security lock. This is the sort of evolution of the Abloy Classic. From a key standpoint, it's actually very similar to what they had before. They've added some new warding. It's got some improvements on it, but it's got some new warding and it slightly adjusts how it interacts with the disk. But the vast majority of the improvements are in the locking mechanism, some anti-pick features in there. Then next we're going to discuss some magnetic keys. And these I'm very uneducated on. I haven't um, worked with these or picked any of these or anything like that. Actually, the middle one I have played with some. I have opened that. It looks like we started seeing these show up around the late 1960s. So you can see this Japanese Miwa. That's considered a high security lock, and on there you can see the magnets on the side of the key. I believe there's versions of this that also have a pin tumbler bitting on the top, so you have a pin tumbler mixed with magnets. This middle one, this Japanese punch lock, is kind of interesting. I've actually seen that turned into a belt buckle. Um, but this is typically made out of a plastic, um, including the key. So it's good for corrosion resistance, but it also limits the security of it. Um, yeah, and you can actually peel off I think it's sort of like a semi-plastic glued down cover on those punch locks, and you can see the magnets underneath them there. And on the far right, you've got an Austrian EVA MCS. And I didn't realize how long these have been made. These are apparently been made 1975 to present, considered high security locks. EVA keys are really interesting to look at. They always seem just really pretty and intricate, and almost sometimes kind of alien looking. Next thing I was going to talk about is Keyway Profiles. So nearly every locking mechanism can be produced with a keyway that accepts keys with one of the following profiles. So flat/open square, paracentric, corrugated, V or U, round, and some different variations of round here. These are not official terms. This is trying to categorize a whole lot of different profiles. But please don't take these as official terms. There's a lot of variations, and there's a lot of things that would not fit perfectly into these categories. The protrusions restricting the keyway are typically called wards. They have the same effect as a warded lock, which is why, in some ways, almost every modern lock is a type of warded lock with additional features, um, but not all. And there's also what's used by a lot of key cutting kiosks to identify the key. So they can clamp down on the warning or the grooves, the QA milling, and identify the key by that profile. So here's some examples of some flat open profiles where there's essentially no warding at all. It's completely open. I've got a Brady safe key on the far left, Sargent and Greenleaf flat steel keys in the middle. That's probably the most common you would see of a completely open keyway. Very common for safety deposit boxes. Sometimes used in hotels as well for storing things for the customers, the guests. And then on the right, you've got this flat Kaba dimple key. Dimple keys will sometimes have a completely open keyway, but oftentimes they will have wards, as we'll see too. So in these cases, um, the disadvantage to no wards can be that you give an attacker, a lockpicker, a lot of room to manipulate their tools in there, um, and that can sometimes be an issue depending on the lock design. So paracentric profiles. Paracentric keyways refers to keyways where warding projects past the center line of the keyway. That's the best definition I could find on it. Sometimes called a restricted keyway, but that can be an overloaded term with keys that are specifically restricted for government use or restricted by patents or restricted by how they are issued and sold. So that's sort of an overloaded term. Um, and also, it's not a true or false so much as a subjective scale. Like how paracentric a lock is something people might debate or argue on. Um, I'm not sure I can say this correctly. The Muspelheimer, Himmer, um, he has suggested a quantitative rather than qualitative definition for paracentricity on Reddit. And so if you're interested in that, I would check that out. Um, I'm not sure. I haven't looked at the definition close enough to say I like 100% agree with it or not. But what I do like is that he is making an effort to say like, okay, let's give this a real term, so it's less of a subjective thing. And I think that's always an improvement, going to lead to improvements in lock design. So I think that's a good way of thinking of things. So I think that's interesting and probably good for the future. So here's a couple of examples of locks with, I guess, what you could call varying paracentricity. On the left, we've got a best small format interchangeable core, very common keyway profile. And on the right, we have an ABUS TS5000. And I was browsing through Lockpicker's United Belt Explorer, looking for examples of wording. When I saw that, I was like, that's a great one. I mean, it's like making a total U-turn right there at the top of the keyway. I'm not sure if y'all can see that, but real strong paracentricity right there. So that makes it more difficult for somebody who's lockpicking to get tools in here and to lift that pin. Whereas if that projection was not there at all, if this was just an open keyway, they would have a lot of room to move their tools, their lockpicks in there. They certainly have room. They can still put their turning tool at the bottom here or the top of the keyway, but this angle right here certainly limits how much room they have for their tools there. This I think is kind of interesting too. So on the left, you can see some varying profiles for common keyways um, for different pen tumbler locks, and you can get an idea just sort of for the different levels of paracentricity you might see. Like some of these are almost completely open. Excuse me. On the right, what I wanted to show was sort of these all sectional versus multi-sectional keys. So what this is showing is how a company will take a profile and they'll add additional warding to sort of implement a keying system. And I don't want to get too much into like master keying or anything like that. But what it means is you can have a certain profile key that can fit into multiple locks. L can fit in C through G, but a C profile key could only fit in a C profile lock, and an H profile key can only fit in a C, CE, or E. And those things can be useful for master keying systems. And it's also something that attackers pay attention to when they're making things like bump keys. They'll look for all sectional keys um, to to make their tools useful on a variety of locks. Another sort of in this, you could consider this a form of paracentric keyway, but a corrugated profile where you've got this sort of uniform, almost stamped out, wavy shape. And you see that with this RFID, or excuse me, RFD um, mail lock key on the left there, and Western Electric 30C key in the center there, and the Miwa U9 on the far right. Um, so you could say that these are paracentric, but we don't, they're not normally referred to that way. You can also see these V or U-shaped profiles. So the Australian lock company Bilock, a very iconic key on the far left there. And on the right, we've got a DOM system D. On the right, excuse me, left Bilock key, right DOM system D. Um, yeah. And you can see different profiles. You can see these round profiles, this Fontaine key on the left and Laperche rolls. There are quite a few of these round profiles. When you start looking at French push pump keys, there's a lot of variations on these round profiles. So here's some more versions of Salon Superlock Company, Nixpix, Alden Corporation Hot Dog Lock, which is interesting. It reminds me of a van key. And then you can also see semi-round profiles. So this is really common with your disc detainer profiles. So on the left, you can see an abloy high profile. So abloy high profile is a type of lock. They call it the high profile, and it is referring to a variety of profiles they make to restrict the keyway and have some key control for those locks. But that high profile, I believe, refers actually to a set of profiles and not one specific profile. And I could be wrong there. Um, and on the right, we can see a variety of different profiles that are sold for blank keys, replacement keys for disc detainer locks. And so some of these are round, and you can see they have a variety of shapes. Some of them are looking almost a little more rectangular. That's going to be the sort of typically um, the newer disc detainer locks, but not always. There's certainly modern disc detainer keys that use a sort of classic abloy classic profile. You can also see those star profiles, very common with the French push pump keys too, like with the round ones on the left. We've got a Pollux 5, the middle, Fichet Bauchi monopole on the far right, a JPM 405. I'm not very familiar with these locks because I very rarely see them in the US. But very interesting to look at too because, I mean, you don't see this stuff in the US very often. They're very curious, very interesting looking. And we also have profiles for so our flag or bit profiles for like our lever keys. So on the bottom left there, you can see some different profiles from the construction of locks, AC Hobbs. And he's showing some different profiles there. On the right, I thought this was kind of interesting. This is from a book that was reprinted, I think, in the late 1800s, but was recreating illustrations from the mid 1600s. So you can see, and it's talking about different metal work. So you can see I think the escutcheon, I'm not sure how to pronounce that correctly, with the keyway in the middle there and the mating key profile on that, which, interestingly, I guess that would be facing away from the key, the way it looks like they mate there. But some interesting, I sort of like those illustrations too because it can show us very specific, at a relatively specific point in time, what locksmiths were making. And you can see some very elaborate metal work there. And to think that that was made by hand in the 1650s is certainly very impressive. And sometimes they'll refer to like locksmiths as metal workers, kind of like jewelers. But somebody made it was an interesting point in a book I was reading recently, The Lure of the Key. The author makes the point that a lot of these locksmiths are working with harder metals than a jeweler. Um, so that the iron and steel is going to be a lot harder to work with than like gold and silver. And I thought that was an interesting point as well. Um, Something I guess missed nowadays, probably more often with the mass manufacturing, but interesting. And I did not provide a lot of examples here for the flag barrel / pipe profile. So on the right, you can see handcuff keys. That's probably the most common example um, of a profile for a barrel key. And then similarly on the wall saw lock on the left there. Um, there is a variety of gauges or sizes for those for sure. Um, I'll go back one. But a lot of times you can also see the same sort of profile you would see for the flag or bit profile um, is going to also apply to these barrel pipe profiles. But then you would, imagine a post in the center of that sort of bullet hole at the top, affecting that profile. And there's some other interesting examples of these from like I think it's the 1800s where there's actually some locks where it looks like there's almost like an S shape or two posts in them. Here's some other profiles from the 17th and 18th century pipe keys. Keys like this would sometimes be made with a mating protective sleeve to protect the profile so that if it wouldn't get like dented or something like that. Um, and that portion of the pipe protected by the sleeve, they would call the tongue. Um, and so that it's possible there was something like that made for these keys. There's a lot of cool examples of interesting profiles from the 17th and 18th century. If you go check it out online, you'll see different like spades and diamonds and a variety of shapes that you can check out. Here's some additional profiles that don't really fit neatly into the categories we've seen. The Iseo Perfecto on the left, and on the right, a Fichet 3D key. One more profile I wanted to sort of talk about I thought was neat was this Urban Alp Stealth key. What I think about is cool about this is they're actually designing the key so that it hides the bitting from any visible angle. And not just from like people taking photos, but also people trying to like use 3D scanners nowadays to copy the bitting. This key is designed so that the bitting is sort of tucked away on the inside of that key in a way that there's no direct line of sight that can interact with it and record it or measure it. So that's kind of neat. Um, okay, so let's talk about bitting a little bit. Um, you can have a variety of bitting. So you can have inline, single bitted, twin inline, double bitted, or multiple inline. And these are general terms referring to essentially the rows of bitting we have, but not necessarily the number. And you can have all sorts of variety of patterns with this. So here's some examples of some common keys like single bitted inline. Probably keys you're all familiar with. On the left, a disk detainer, the middle, a pen tumbler, on the far right, a lever key. Okay, in the middle here, so we've got some versions of twin inline. So we've got multiple rows of tumblers that need to be interacted with on the key. So on the left here, we've got an acid twin that interacts, the top set of ridges there are going to interact with pin tumblers. And then on the bottom here, we've got another set of cutouts here to interact with side pins. In the middle here, we've got a Fichet 44, and we've got 2 rows of bitting to interact with the levers there. And on the far right, we've got a Sargent & Greenleaf 6880. And I'm assuming this is a safe lock here just based on the very long length of the keyway there. And we see some double bitting there. You can also see triple bitted systems, this Bricard Super Surette. Excuse me, I'm sure I butchered that. Forgive me. But you can see the 3 rows of bitting on this. And then you can have more, so we can have quad bitted. So on the far left, we have some dimple keys, the Cava Quattro Plus that has 4 rows, interact with 4 rows of pin tumblers and the dimple lock. Same or similar with this BKS Janus dimple key in the center here. And probably something more common, more people would have seen on the far right. We've got what is typically referred to as a cruciform key for pin tumblers. So this is a Wilson 18 pin one. Yeah, and so you'll see a lot of those. Those are fairly common nowadays. Definitely much more common than the dimple key versions, at least in the U.S. right now. But a lot of them are imported right now from China as far as the cruciform keys and those locks. All right, so materials for mechanical keys. So variety of materials, wood, used in some of the earliest lock and key systems. If you look at some of the sort of artisan keys being made in Africa, you'll still see some wood keys for those as well. But more often you'll see iron, common in early forged keys, bronze, early alloy, valued for corrosion resistance and castability, brass, common modern key material due to machinability and corrosion resistance, nickel silver, copper, nickel, zinc alloy, harder and more resistant than brass and often used for higher quality keys. No silver in it, but it's called that because its appearance looks a little bit like silver. Steel keys, very strong and resistant to deformation. So if there's going to be a lot of use, a more industrial key, you might have a steel key. Aluminum, lightweight, less durable, much more likely to be damaged. That might even be a disposable type of key. And then plastic and polymer keys. You don't typically see these, but there are some specialized applications, some certain like surreptitious handcuff keys and some sort of almost more functional service keys like for bathroom container, like the dispensers and stuff for like paper towels and toilet paper and stuff. Sometimes you'll see those. On the far right is kind of an interesting key. It's a Victory key. It was manufactured during World War II as part of material conservation efforts because brass was needed sometimes for things like shell casings and in limited demand. The idea was that there was a key where you could reuse parts of the key um, so you could still keep like a brass blade that's good for the lock, but then you could have like some sort of steel bow. It's my understanding that these never took off and were not very much appreciated. That the the fit between the bow and the blade there was not super strong. Um, but I mean, there was actually pretty extreme. I don't think we talk about it very much nowadays, but there was pretty extreme conservation efforts in the U.S. during World War II. A lot of materials were in very limited supply. Even you've got the steel pennies from 1943. Um, so this would have been an additional effort in that sort of conservation there. And they're kind of interesting to look at, I think. So we're going to talk a little about electric keys. I am not very familiar with these, but I also wanted to not ignore them, and I did want to cover them some. So let's jump into it. So electric keys, Magstripe. See the first prototypes of these in 1960 by IBM, um, and you can see a 1980 version there on the far left. These are still used today. You can see this US DoD CAC card, Common Access Card, provides Magstripe and RFID for physical access control for accessing buildings and doors. The ICC integrated circuit chip there is typically used for network or computer access and cryptographic keys, not actually used for like physical access control that I saw anywhere. And these magnetically record information on the keys that can be read by the lock on that strip there. You can have smart card keys. On the far left, you see an early smart card prototype by Roland Moreno, made in 1975. In these keys, we have actual physical contacts that are transmitting information as well as um, some sort of integrated circuitry, providing some logic. Um, I looked pretty hard and I did not see an example of a lock actually using the smart card with an ICC for physical access control. It seems that they were industry always preferred Magstripe or the RF contactless cards or some other form of contact, but not to use the sort of smart card contacts. There's contactless versions, but I didn't see any. I'd be really interested if anyone's aware of them actually being used somewhere, um, but I couldn't find any examples. So continuing, so here's some examples. These are using contacts, so they are using some integrated circuitry like you see above here. So these are using integrated circuitry, but they're using direct physical contact with the lock to transmit information and power. On the left, you've got an acetwin maximum with click technology. Uh, and this is an interesting key. It records access attempts in the key and the lock, and allows electronically blocking lost or stolen keys. Um, and you have some transmission via the metal contacts there. Um, and both these locks are proprietary, and there's relatively limited information to the general public. I imagine if you were purchasing enough of these, you could probably get more detailed specs on them. But there's relatively limited information to the general public on their websites for the exact technology inside of these. On the right, we've got a Van Mall lock and key. This is interesting. Allows a single key to open multiple locks, programmable via a Bluetooth app, and can be set up to use fingerprints, so you get that biometric functions and that two-factor authentication. And these are open to the public. You can buy these on Amazon. Oops, excuse me. Those are available on Amazon, and I think generally more affordable to the general public. I can't speak to the security of them. I can say that on the left, the acetwin maximum physical key, there is a high security lock that they're mixing with that click technology. So we can talk about transponders. This is probably what most people are familiar with as far as electronic keys. Car key transponders can use a variety of technologies inside of them. So you start, I think originally you see like these remote keyless systems for unlocking the doors and trunks around 350, 433 megahertz, depending on if you're in the US or Europe. And that's still used today. Uh, the immobilizer used to actually start the vehicle or block the vehicle from starting. So in the 1980s, GM came out with a vehicle anti-theft system that actually embedded a resistor in the key blade, and the resistance value needed to be correct for that vehicle for it to allow you to start the vehicle. And then in the 90s, we start seeing these wireless detection antenna in the keybow. So you have an antenna inside your keybow that is excited by a mating antenna um, inside the steering column. And they can transmit data back and forth and verify that it is the correct key um, via RFID. And these are now required in many countries. I didn't realize that, but they're for new manufacturing in Germany, UK, Finland, Australia, and for certain vehicles in Canada. And it's actually kind of interesting if you ever use like a remote start system, at least in the past. One of the ways they did that was by actually storing one of those keys inside under the steering column. You would have a valet key in there that did have the transponder, and it would be wrapped with another antenna setup that would be tied into the wiring, I guess sort of in parallel with the existing antenna for the steering column. So anyways, if you opened up the wiring underneath the steering column, you would find another key in there, which is, I think, kind of interesting. Because it's an anti-theft system that has the key to the car inside of it. If you rip all that stuff out, you get the key, which I just find a little interesting. And then you can also have Bluetooth is now used for presence detection to unlock a car and allow it to be started when the owner is nearby or in the car. I know my wife's dad's pretty happy about that on his new car right now. He thinks it's pretty awesome. There's a couple of examples of an immobilizer and a GM's VATS key. So you can also have RFID, very similar to the transponders. On the left is a HID Prox Key 3. I know that they do access control, and they also do. They also provide devices for like secure communications and encrypting communications. And on the right, you've got an RFID card being used at a turnstile for Mexico City public transport. Same principles, different medium for containing those antennas and that circuitry. And now we see them a lot more in residential environments with wireless Bluetooth interacting or interfacing with people's cell phones. So it allows the cell phone itself to become the key. And it's being adopted by major manufacturers. Yale, Kwikset, Schlage, Philips, Eufy are all providing these. And it can even further interface with people's home security systems or smart home systems like Google Nest. So uh, it both opens certain security concerns about wireless transmission, backup systems, interceptions, things like that are certainly risks, but it also adds a lot of security features as far as logging and auditing and interfacing with other things like home surveillance and stuff. So it's a lot of potential there for sure. And we also see biometric systems. So on the left, G-Home smart fingerprint door lock. On the right, a palm lock. Excuse me, Wise palm lock, smart door lock with palm vein recognition. And I'll be honest, I am very unfamiliar with how these systems work in detail. Um, but you are the key, which is certainly interesting. All right, so I'm going to run through some special purpose keys. Valet key, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and read these to you. If you don't want to hear it, go ahead and feel free to skip ahead and skip forward. So what is a valet key? That's a key that operates limited functions or locks. It's common with cars. You're going somewhere and you give a person your valet key and it lets them start the car, but not necessarily access the trunk or glove box. If you ever look at your car, oftentimes there's a lock down to your left side of the driver's side that allows you to lock the trunk as well, to lock the trunk release. And you could only do that with the main key and not unlock it with the valet key. You can have a maid key, which is another term for a master key, allowing access to multiple locks. In some cases, like the Winfield locks, it can refer to a key that also allows the locks to be rekeyed for a new change or guest key. You can have control keys. These are keys used to open, modify, or maintain a lock. Used to remove the core and interchangeable core locks, and also for like the Sergeant and Greenleaf 831 military locks, used to disassemble those and take them apart. You can have change or guest keys. So this is a key bitted to open a single lock. Or a set of locks with the same bidding. So maybe you have like 5 locks that are all keyed the same. The key to that would still be called a change or guest key, as opposed to various lock bidding like would be used for a master key. The change key can also refer to a key used to change the combination on like a safe dial. So that's another term for another use of that term. Construction key is a key which operates a lock while construction on a building is occurring. However, once the owner uses their key, that construction key no longer works. And that's kind of an interesting thing. If you want to check out how those work, check out LockWiki. It'll explain that. You can have emergency and first responder keys, keys that allow those personnel entrance to like a building. The main example of that is Knox keys, restricted generally like firemen, paramedics to allow them into a building. You can have service keys, keys that allow access to control, access or control, typically for like maintenance purposes, like a drop key allowing you to manually open elevator doors. Really, no reason to normally do that. Guard key can refer to different things. In a dual control key system, such as a bank safe deposit box, or yeah, safe deposit box, refers to the key required by the guard. So you've got two keys. The one that's going to be used by the guard is going to be that guard key. But it can also refer to a very specific type of key that was used in the 20th century to record if a guard had made their runs on a patrol, and it would like imprint a number or something like that on a recording to say, yes, this person's actually been there. And if you want to learn more about that, check out Watch Clocks or Detect's Guardman. Master key, it's a key allows access to multiple locks with different bidding. Renter key, so in a dual control key system, such as a bank safe, safe deposit box, that's the key going to be used by the renter as opposed to the guard key. And it can also just be used generally as a key for a rental property. A designated key is a key that has a stamp or inscription stating the purpose or ownership of the key. So that's typically going to happen post 1800s. People start saying, hey, what is this key actually for? Post 1800s, you also start seeing manufacturers stamp their keys saying, hey, I made this key. I think Brahma was one of the first people or first manufacturers to really push saying, hey, I made this. The maker's mark or bidding codes are not considered designated key, though. That's just FYI. You can have armors or magazine keys. These are typically keys for an armory. And in the past, were made of non-sparking metals. I'm not sure how much the concern was really non-sparking, and it was just for its corrosion resistance. But it is said that that was a thought in their considerations for making them. Chamberlain's key is originally a key for the king's quarters, later used to symbolize trust, rank, authority. In certain cases, certain, I guess, monarchs, I'm not sure the right term, would hand out, some of these got handed out a ton, some of them were much more restrictive. Um, and then a masterpiece key. We saw one of those earlier on, a French masterpiece key when we were looking at the warding. And this is a key made to demonstrate level of skill in metalwork and locksmithing, and to qualify in a guild as a master locksmith. So we don't see locksmiths. So the term locksmith has certainly changed over the years. If you look at a locksmith, um, like pre 1600s, it's a metal worker, and then in like 1600s to 1800s, you see this sort of locksmith sort of developing into a very skilled niche metal worker that might have done locks and they might have done clocks. But they're specializing in these unique skills and might be part of a guild, especially in like France, England, Germany. Um, and then, post 1900s with the Industrial Revolution, you see the term changing and you see less of locksmiths manufacturing locks and keys and more of them maintaining them when they're mass produced. And so that's just a general overview. And then a locksmith today, a lot of times, will give like security advice to somebody or to a business. They'll not just maintain the locks, but they'll also advise the business on a good security posture for their environment and what they have. So going to locksmiths more, what are some keys that are unique to locksmiths? 999 keys, depth and spacing keys. These are reference keys for cutting by code. They can be used for like key duplication, key duplication machines to cut a key by code. And they're sometimes, I don't think so much nowadays, but in the past they were sometimes sold with the surreptitious kind of understanding, not surreptitious, that's not the right word, but mischievous, deviant, I don't know, understanding that they would be used as bump keys. And bump key is a key that's had the lowest bidding. It's been cut to its lowest bidding, often called a 999 key. Sometimes with slight shoulder modifications. And these keys are a semi-kinetic but also very surreptitious attack that allows people to manipulate a lock open pretty quickly. There's a lot of information out there on those if you want to check it out. I'm not going to cover it here. Um, you have jiggler keys. You can see those there, bottom left. These are flat general profile keys meant to approximate a large variety of different biddings. And because they're flat, they're generally meant to fit in a variety of different wording. And they're used as a broad test rather than a precise match. Tryout keys are similar, but they're typically a set of OEM or modified OEM keys, and usually specific to they're usually more specific to one lock or one brand. Um, and then you can have lockout keys like you see on the right there. These are keys designed to block normal use once inserted. They often detach the bow from the shank or stem, but not always. There's cases like USPS lockout keys that would have been used by a postmaster, and they would just stick them in from I guess, the mail side, the internal side of the building, and they would stick them in and leave them there, and then the renter wouldn't be able to stick in their key until they paid whatever dues they needed to use their PO box. Um, and there were also cases of them being used by salesmen, traveling salesmen in the early 1900s. They might want to leave some expensive equipment in a room, but also not have the owner of that place that they're staying take that equipment, so they might insert a lockout key into their own room before they left it to prevent the owner from going in there. Trick keys. This is a kind of neat one right here. This is a padlock that looks like a key that accepts a key to open it. So it's kind of neat. It's probably from the 18th century, made of iron and brass. I'm not sure about the country of origin. I've heard different things, different places. So yeah, but it is definitely an interesting little thing. Jailer's key or gun keys. So these are something from I think it was the 1800s, where you see I mean, because really the pipe keys or the barrel keys are a long barrel. So you could certainly um, put a hole in them, add some gunpowder, and ignite that just to create a flash of smoke to intimidate people or a prisoner. Or you could add, a musket ball or bullet, and it does definitely become a firearm. Um, I think that when I was reading The Lure of the Key, it was my understanding that most of these were actually modified keys afterwards, where people modified it to do this, and I don't know how well it worked with that modification. It's certainly a relatively dangerous thing to do, but it's very rare to find a key that was originally designed for this purpose. And I believe they're very sought after collectibles because you have both key collectors and firearms collectors looking for them. Puzzle keys. So this is a very common puzzle key you'll see nowadays, and I just find it amusing too because you'll often see it see it being sold as some unusual or strange lever key or worded key. But it's a very common puzzle key. It's a neat little puzzle, not too hard. It's kind of fun. And novelty keys. These are kind of neat too. I think they're kind of amusing. It's typically sold as Old West antique keys. You'll see them with a key tag, generally for like a brothel or a jail or an insane asylum kind of thing. Um, and you'll also often see like novelty locks being sold with those too. I think they're kind of neat. You will occasionally see people trying to sell them as real, and that's certainly shady and not ideal. Keys that don't go to locks. I'll just mention these because you'll see these a lot often too. Clock and watch winding keys. These often look like a screw or spiral key, but they can be more ornate. Not always, though. Like on the far left there, that clock or watch key could certainly be a form of worded key. And these keys that you see on the right could also be a modern form of spiral key. But in general, these are going to be going to clock or watch windings. Um, but it can be hard to tell. So key corrosion and maintenance. So protective coatings, very common recommendation is using Renaissance microcrystalline wax polish and just putting that over the keys. to sort of secure them from the external elements. For iron or steel internals for long-term storage, not for your front door on your house, but long-term storage of iron locks. Break-free CLP is an oil typically used for firearms, but it can be used for old iron locks to keep the internals of those from rusting out. For a lock that's actively in use, it's not recommended to use heavy oils, greases, and nowadays it's even discouraged to use the dry graphite powder that was commonly recommended in the past. I think the general advice nowadays is to use a greaseless lubricant, and LPS1 is a very, very popular one. For storage, you want to limit humidity, and you can do that with silica gel. Generally want to keep it low, 30 to 40%, and avoid mixed metals touching that can cause galvanic corrosion over time. And generally handling by the edges. Obviously, that depends on how important whatever it is you're trying to protect or maintain. But the salt and the sweat can lead to I believe it's called chlorides getting deposited on keys, and that can eventually lead to different types of corrosion. Brass and bronze cleaning, you don't want to clean these with acids. It can damage the patina and enable corrosion. And that's the more serious risk, is that the acids can enable some bad forms of corrosion. It's better to use like a distilled water and mild soap. Orvis Wa paste was recommended as a very, very safe paste. But generally, if you look for something that's unscented and pH neutral and like a mild soap, that's going to be safer to use for your brass or bronze. For rust or iron or steel cleaning, generally um, there are chemical cleaners to remove rust, but they are pretty intense. They can cause once you remove all that rust, it can completely destroy the patina. You can see a lot of pitting left over. It's kind of rough. It's not necessarily visually appealing. Easier or less intense method is soak them in distilled white vinegar, 5% acidity overnight. Rinse it with water. Scrub it with a plastic brush or a brass brush. And then to neutralize that acid a little bit, you're going to want to soak it. Take a cup of water and add like a tablespoon of baking soda, and let it soak in there to help neutralize any leftover acid that might be on it. Rinse it with water again, distilled water if you want to be extra careful, and then pat dry or rinse with alcohol and air dry, and then go back to those protective coatings at the top. One thing I didn't know about this until recently, but it was kind of scary-ish. Bronze disease. So this is a chemical reaction that can spread across artifacts with any copper content, not specifically just bronze, and eventually destroys the artifact. And you can see some of that on the right there. And at the very beginning of the slides, you can see that on some of the bronze keys for the warded locks. It's more common with artifacts that have been recovered from the ocean or in a coastal area. And it can completely destroy it and spread to other items through the humidity or touch or the dust getting in the air. So there are stable forms of it. I'm not an expert on it, but generally, if you're seeing flaking or powdering, it's considered more dangerous. Treatment is to initially quarantine it from the other objects, get it in a dry place away from your other copper keys, and then the chloride corrosion can spread. You're going to want to clean your hands before touching any of the other objects. And the chemicals used to actually treat it are pretty dangerous, toxic and carcinogenic. So they're BTAs. There is information online about how to use those. Certainly, if you decide to do that, you need to make sure that you're following good safety precautions, and you may, depending on what the object is, may need to seek professional assistance. Um, there are alternatives that are not use less toxic and carcinogenic chemicals, um, but the general consensus is they're certainly not guaranteed to work, and your money may vary. Um, but yeah, that's a whole nother topic on its own that I'm not an expert on. Yep. So resources for the future. Lock, Safe, and Security, International Police Reference by Mark Tobias. I think just about everybody's heard about that book. Extremely popular. Another big one, High Security Mechanical Locks, an Encyclopedia Reference, Graham Pulford. A lot of information on high security locks there and different keys that are associated with them. The Lure of the Key, Knowledge Acquired from Some 35 Years Collecting. That's a great book if you're interested in medieval keys. And if you're interested in like collector example medieval keys. Very a lot of high quality photos of like fine art, basically keys that are fine art at that point. Museums and institutional collections, Met Museum, Smithsonian Institute, Omnia, and the Shell Collection all were super helpful as well for the photos and the slides. And specialty and community resources, LPU, Belt, and LockWiki, definitely extremely helpful for the pictures and the slides. LockCollectors.eu, BuildingConversation.com, Wikimedia Commons, once again, very helpful for the images and the slides, and theartoflockpicking.com. So those are all good resources to check out in the future. And then now it's your turn. So after watching this video, can you identify these keys? And I'm not going to put the answers there. I'm just going to, let's see how y'all can do. Hopefully you can get them all. I would say that there is one key on here where it is arguable what type of key it is, more so than the others. But yeah, good luck. I hope that that was useful to somebody out there. Hopefully this has been entertaining and not death by PowerPoint. And yeah, hopefully there's some usefulness out there for y'all. And thank you for watching. Take care. I will put a link to the presentation. I'll upload that somewhere and put a link to it if you just want to check out the PDF or the LibreOffice version of it as well. So, yep. Thank you all for watching and hope you take care.